presentations. So now I would like to invite Madeleine Tenniger from the European Commission to give her presentation on the European trade policy review. Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Oh, good morning, everybody. I'm going to have a little challenge, so I potentially get help to see if I manage this time to upload the presentation. And I'm going to ask, do you have it now?
No, we don't have it yet.
We don't have it. Otherwise, maybe the easiest is if you upload it. I think so.
Yes, Alice is sharing, so in a minute it will be.
Yeah, it's a bit quicker than sorry, I struggle.
That's okay, please
Hello.
go ahead.
A pleasure to be here with you. So I'm Madeleine Tenniger and I'm working in DG Trade in a unit that deals with trade sustainable development, and in particular we deal with the WTO from a sort of tool point of view, and then we deal with the trade and thematic topics, so trade and climate, trade and environment, gender, human rights, and so on. So circular economy is certainly one of the topics to which we are actively looking. Maybe we start. So I'm going to give a presentation that starts with trade policy review. I'll focus. It's a long presentation. We decided to leave it. If you want to have a look at it, then you can look also at the other elements. But I'm going to focus more on the green parts. So maybe can we go to the first slide? So, I mean, a few introductory words on the new trade policy communication, which, as I put here in the first slide, has three key elements: openness as a strategic choice, sustainability as a central pillar, and assertiveness in our action. You may have read that this is put together under the concept of an open strategic economy. And that joins up both internal and external action, EU action, across multiple policy areas. So what does this mean? This means it tries to encompass our commitment to open and fair trade with well-functioning, diversified and sustainable global value chain. And it encompasses, and maybe we go to the next slide, I think there is yes, exactly here. So it is to support, I think on screen at least we have something weird disturbing the image, but that's yes, thank you. So three objectives of EU trade policy are to support the recovery and fundamental transformation of the EU economy in a way that is consistent with our green and digital ambitions. As you will have seen in the trade policy communication, green and the Green Deal really becomes a centerpiece. Secondly, the objective is to shape global rules for a more sustainable and fair globalization. And so also here, green comes back, and fair and just terminology have been used, and increasing our capacity. Third, increasing our capacity to pursue our interests and enforce our rights. So this comes together, and if needed, autonomously. This comes together in the next slide in what we have labeled this open strategic economy. Yeah? And in a way, if you want, it's both a model and a mindset. So it tries to pull together the three little rounds that you see there, with resilience and competitiveness, sustainability and fairness, and at the same time also assertiveness and rules-based cooperation. So it's how to maximize our ability to make our own choices and shape the world around us through leadership and engagement, reflecting our strategic interest and values. But the strength should come through openness and our commitment to a rule-based multilateral system. And of course, and that's the assertiveness, we cooperate and engage where we can, but we should not hesitate to use autonomous measures where necessary. Maybe the next slide, please. So there are 6 key areas in the medium term. And maybe to pick out those that are of particular relevance for green. Of course, everywhere green and sustainability comes back, but within the reform of the WTO, and I'll get back to it, the reform of the WTO, we have the multilateral action on the trade and environment, support to a green transition and promote responsible and sustainable value chains. A lot comes back here, whether it is government action or business action. Let me just have a look. Yes, most is under that. And then also the last bullet, strengthen the EU's focus on implementation and enforcement of trade agreements and ensure a level playing field. This is also particularly important for sustainability, be it because through our trade agreements, we also want to promote and see international the international rules enforced, be they the multilateral environment agreement or the agreements in the ILO. As part of that, we've been stepping up action. Maybe the next slide. So the first, and what I'll enter into is not the overall reform of the WTO, but I'll talk about the green agenda. So within the reform of the WTO, maybe I should say that first, WTO and the multilateral commitment is clearly coming through the trade policy communication. As you've seen, there is an annex dedicated to the WTO reform. Within that, we are looking at modernizing the rules and improving the functionality. In terms of, you have here the ambitions for the WTO, but they are less relevant for you, the dispute settlement mechanism. And then the second is an important one, seek the adoption of initial WTO reforms focused on sustainability. So what are we looking at within the framework of the WTO? And I think the previous presentation have already looked at that. Where we come from an environmental goods agreement focus, or I would nearly say a focus that is more individual. We have the environmental goods agreement negotiations, we have fishery subsidies, we have individual elements that we've been looking at. At this moment, we are looking in a much more encompassing way at the WTO, and as also seen in previous presentations, looking into the different functionalities of the WTO, whether it is goods or whether it is services or whether it is the transparency function, etc. What can we do and what should we do to reinforce the environment? We've set up a process in the WTO to make more friends and supporters amongst the WTO members. That's called the so-called structured discussion process, through which we also establish a dialogue with stakeholders. And that is a process that where we want to promote a broader support for trade and environment anchored in the WTO, but also where we want to work together with partners to have an as ambitious as possible statement and results at the next ministerial. Within that, the EU is also committed to make proposals take initiatives and actions for climate and sustainability. And that was also announced in the trade policy communication. Next slide. So this is the greenest trade policy ever. And as I said, really, if you read through the document, I think you can do a search on green and Green Deal. I forgot the number of times it comes back, but it's really placed at the center of trade policy. To put together here a couple of dimensions, the WTO initiative, so I've elaborated on that. Bilaterally, there are also a number of dimensions. So in terms of climate, the communication states that we will not conclude trade agreements with G20 partners that have not committed to climate objectives, and these are, broadly speaking, net zero commitment 2050 and a pathway reflected in the national determined contributions. Then we have a couple of elements that strengthen the cooperation on all Green Deal aspects, such as biodiversity, sustainable food policy, pollution and circular economy. There is also so FTAs is platform for cooperation. Then we have the stepping up and improvement of implementation and enforcement under bilateral, but also unilateral, also the GSP. So we've established, as you may know, the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. This is both a process and an instrument. The idea is that we step up and streamline implementation actions, but also do not hesitate to trigger dispute settlement where needed to ensure effective implementation of agreements. The other element that is important also for you here is that we agree to have an early review of our strategy on TSD, Trade and Sustainable Development chapters in FTAs. And this early review will take place this year. And we'll review both the implementation and enforcement and lessons learned and see what new avenues we would need to pursue. Then what is very important, you see there are two other elements here, that these are due diligence and unilateral measures. So unilateral due diligence is also an EU autonomous measure. So we, as said, we should not hesitate to rely on autonomous measures where necessary. There's three highlighted in the trade policy communication: CBAM, the carbon border adjustment measures, deforestation, and diligence legislation that we are developing right now. But all of them are in full development and full swing. So I think they all speak for themselves. What is maybe new nuance or is complying with all the necessary non-discrimination rules in the WTO. And there are a couple of other requirements that they need to protect the global environment. But this is quite an innovative push. In terms of the other innovative push is the recognition of the importance of the role of business in securing sustainable supply chains. And you will have seen that we move from, we're developing at this moment mandatory due diligence. Skip this. Have a read at it and you can come back. The implementation and enforcement is also cross-cutting, not only for green, but I think also important for green. So the implementation and enforcement relevant points for us are already mentioned. That is the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer and the fact that we will have a review of bilateral trade agreements and the TSD chapters in there. Next slide. Global alliances, here is the US. Of course, this is there's optimism, let's put it that way, optimism following Biden's clear commitment to climate and the green agenda. So we are hopeful that we also, in the WTO and in other fora, we can cooperate and take a global leadership together. Certainly in the WTO, from my EGA, Environmental Goods Agreement days, I remember that cooperation with the US has not only been very good, but also important. At this moment, at least the translation of their green commitment to the trade agenda is under revision at this moment. You may know that Katherine Tai, who will be the new boss for USTR, has been or is nominated. I think it's supposed to happen this week. So we will probably in the coming weeks engage in further discussion to have a clarification on how this translates to trade policy. Of course, we are already now in contact, but I think people very much aware to what this means. So that part and the green agenda will be important also from a trade perspective. And at least at our level, colleagues are very keen to work with us. Next one. Yes, so here, so that was my presentation on the trade policy review. Here I have one or two slides, not one slide on trade and circular economy. Just an illustration, what we have in our FTAs and what we're doing in the WTO. It's a snapshot. I just looked carefully at the excellent presentation of before of on the WTO and also the FTAs, very, very useful, because indeed, if you talk about the concept of circular economy, it's not something that's going to be in one chapter. It is cross-cutting, and the art is to look at what are the areas within the WTO and FTAs that matter for, in this case, circular economy, and how can we look at that. So for example, in the TSD chapters in EU FTAs, as such, they function as a platform for cooperation. And we have a range of relevant multilateral environment agreements that are particularly relevant: Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and the Stockholm Conventions. Then across the FTAs, we've already mentioned tariffs. So here we give an example: abolishing tariffs on repaired and remanufactured goods, but there are more. Sustainable use of raw materials. We have a raw material chapter in our FTAs, and commitments on recycling, repair, and maintenance services. This is not a limitative list, and there may be others. So then in the WTO, those who've been following the WTO may remember that, or will know that circular economy actually has really become a core item of discussion and review. Somehow, amongst all the environmental topics that I've seen, it is one that is embraced by many, and it doesn't divide developing and developed countries. On the contrary, it seems to be a concept that makes economically utter sense. Now, people may have a different interpretation on it, and be at a different status or place within the circularity, but it is a concept that everybody finds important, whether it is specific on something as plastics, and Fiji and China have taken a plastic initiative, or across the circularity. So I can fully support also the previous slides I've seen on it. Now, what are we looking at? So the conceptual understanding, I think that's one of the things we've been doing in WTO. What does circularity mean in the economy, and what does it mean for trade policy? If you also, within the WTO, look at the functionalities you have, transparency was already mentioned, not only the TBT committee, but particularly also within the Committee on Trade and Environment. We think that committee should really become much more proactive in its transparency function, and including also exchanges on domestic legislation, how countries are dealing with environmental challenges. What we are doing is at this moment we are looking at, can we relaunch goods negotiations, and can we relaunch services negotiations? Within these, the concept of a circular economy certainly also plays an important role. So we're looking at that, and with a particular emphasis to reflect on particular interest developing countries also may have, because they've given such a support to circular economy. So like that, we are looking through the functionalities of the WTO, so greening aid for trade. But I think what is also important, and what was mentioned, is that we will need to have, continue to have what some call topical discussions, thematic discussions, whatever we want to call it, because it's only by looking at this circular economy as a concept that one will understand within the trade world, whether one negotiates goods or one negotiates standards, why it comes together in a circular economy concept. And as you may know, the WTO is not organized in circularity, but the WTO is organized in groups dealing with trading goods. You have committees on the TBT committee, you have a services group. So one of the things we want to try to pull together in this trade and environment group that we've created is precisely to bring these various dimensions together. So I think I'll leave it here, and happy to